What if the hardest part of raising a Cane Corso isn't the size, but the emotional atmosphere they create inside your home? Because the first thing people notice about a Cane Corso is usually physical: the massive frame, the heavy stare, the way strangers instinctively step aside when the dog enters a room. But inside a family home, the real impact is psychological. A Cane Corso changes the feeling of a house, not overnight, quietly. At first, it feels comforting, protective even. There's something deeply reassuring about a dog that seems aware of everything: every sound outside the door, every movement in the hallway, every unfamiliar face entering the living room. They don't just exist beside the family, they monitor it. And that hypervigilance creates a strange emotional pressure most owners never anticipate. Ordinary moments begin shifting in subtle ways. Guests become more cautious, kids grow more aware of boundaries. Family members unconsciously lower energy around the dog during tense moments. Not because the dog is dangerous, because the dog is always emotionally present. That's the contradiction at the center of the Cane Corso experience. They can be deeply loving, intensely loyal, unbelievably connected to their family, while simultaneously becoming the emotional center of gravity inside the home. And the unsettling part: most owners don't realize the emotional shift until the dog is already psychologically running the house. But that emotional shift doesn't begin with aggression, it begins with admiration. For many families, the Cane Corso doesn't just look impressive, it feels emotionally reassuring. In a world that often feels unpredictable, overstimulated, and strangely unsafe, there's something deeply comforting about a dog that appears completely unshakable. A dog that watches the front door before you do. A dog that positions itself between your children and strangers without being asked. A dog that seems willing to absorb danger before it ever reaches the family. That emotional appeal runs deeper than aesthetics. The Cane Corso represents certainty, strength, control, loyalty, protection, and modern families are starving for those feelings. That's why so many people fall in love with the fantasy almost instantly. Online, the image is irresistible: a giant guardian peacefully sleeping beside toddlers, calmly escorting children through parks, silently watching over the home like a living security system wrapped in muscle and devotion. The videos feel cinematic, almost mythological, a fearless protector with the heart of a nanny. But social media often captures only the still moments, the quiet snapshots, the perfectly framed seconds where the dog appears emotionally effortless. What families mistake for emotional simplicity is usually emotional restraint. Because beneath that calm exterior is a breed carrying centuries of psychological conditioning. Cane Corsos were never designed to simply coexist passively with human life. They were bred to assess environments, monitor movement, control territory, and react to potential threats before anyone else noticed them. That wiring never fully turns off. Not in the backyard, not during family gatherings, not even during ordinary evenings in the living room. And at first, families interpret that constant awareness as intelligence and devotion. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's the beginning of something much heavier. Because a modern family home was never designed for a dog constantly scanning the world, your Cane Corso may love your family deeply, but emotionally it may also feel responsible for controlling it. That is the silent job so many owners never see. A guardian breed does not simply enter a home and relax into the furniture like an ordinary companion. It studies, it monitors, it files away patterns that most people never notice. The sound of the front gate, a new voice in the hallway, the rhythm of footsteps at night, a shift in the mood of the room after an argument. Nothing is meaningless to a dog like this. Everything becomes information, and that's where the emotional weight starts building. Because a Cane Corso is often not just living inside the environment, it is supervising it, constantly, quietly. The dog may lie down, close its eyes, and seem calm on the surface, but underneath that stillness is a mind that does not fully switch off. It is always assessing, always comparing, always deciding whether the world is stable enough to ignore. That kind of vigilance is powerful. It is also exhausting. especially when the family begins mistaking obedience for emotional ease. A dog can sit, a dog can stay, a dog can follow commands beautifully and still carry a private burden of responsibility. That burden becomes visible in small moments. A guest arrives and the dog locks onto them before anyone says a word. Children start running and the energy in the room changes instantly. A playful argument between family members can make the dog tense, hover, or position itself closer to the center of the action as if trying to understand whether peace has been broken. The Cane Corso is not reading words, it is reading atmosphere, and in a family home, atmosphere moves fast. People underestimate how strongly dogs absorb emotional energy, but a breed built for protection tends to catch tension before the humans in the room have even admitted it exists. Raised voices, abrupt movement, uneven routines, quiet stress. These things can settle into the dog like weather, and once that happens, the dog's behavior begins to reflect the household back to itself, not as a mirror, as a witness, sometimes even as a participant. And when a dog bred for protection absorbs modern family chaos, the result is often emotional confusion on both sides. The first sign usually doesn't look dangerous at all. It looks loyal. In fact, most families feel flattered by it at first. The Cane Corso starts following one person everywhere, room to room, door to door, waiting outside bathrooms, sleeping near entrances, watching them cook, clean, move, rest. People call it love, and part of it is. But sometimes it's something more psychologically complicated beginning to form underneath the surface. Because slowly, almost invisibly, the dog stops simply accompanying the family member and starts monitoring them. That distinction matters a lot. The early signs are subtle enough that most owners never recognize them as tension building in real time. The dog begins positioning itself in hallways, sitting between people during conversations, blocking doors without being asked, staring intensely during emotional interactions as if trying to interpret who controls the atmosphere of the room. None of it feels aggressive. That's what makes it so easy to miss. The behavior often looks calm, controlled, protective, even affectionate. And because the dog appears obedient, families unintentionally reward it. They praise the closeness, encourage the shadowing, laugh when the dog refuses to give them personal space, without realizing they may be reinforcing emotional hypervigilance. Over time, the Cane Corso can begin attaching itself not just to people, but to patterns, specific routines, specific positions in the house, specific emotional expectations about how the family should move and interact. And when those expectations are interrupted, the dog doesn't always experience it casually. Sometimes it experiences it as instability. That's when protection slowly starts transforming into emotional control, not through dominance in the dramatic way people imagine, but through emotional dependency, constant monitoring, inability to disengage, the feeling that the dog is carrying responsibility it was never meant to carry alone. That's the hidden psychological line many owners fail to see. A bonded dog feels connected to the family. A burdened dog feels responsible for the family. And eventually, that emotional burden creates a moment that catches almost every Cane Corso owner completely off guard. The terrifying part isn't when the dog becomes aggressive. It's when the family starts reorganizing their lives around the dog's emotions. That's the midpoint many Cane Corso owners never see coming. Because by now, the dog usually still looks good, obedient, protective, attached, highly aware. From the outside, everything may even appear impressive. But inside the home, the emotional atmosphere has started tightening. Guests are no longer simple visits, they become managed events. Doors are held carefully, introductions are controlled. Voices lower slightly when new people enter the house. Someone always watches the dog's body language in the background, even during ordinary conversations. Without saying it out loud, the family begins emotionally orbiting the dog. Parents become hyper-aware of triggers, the sound of rough play, sudden movement, excited screaming, delivery drivers outside the gate, teenagers entering loudly with friends. Even laughter can suddenly feel like something that needs supervision, and children notice it too. Kids are extraordinarily sensitive to emotional tension inside a home. even when adults think they're hiding it well. They begin adjusting instinctively, running less wildly through hallways, becoming more cautious during play, looking toward the dog before doing things that once felt natural. Not because the Cane Corso is constantly attacking or out of control, because everyone feels the possibility of emotional escalation sitting quietly in the room. That's what chronic vigilance does to a household, and the tragedy is that the dog itself is often suffering too. A Cane Corso was built to carry responsibility, but modern family life floods that instinct with nonstop stimulation. Noise, visitors, social unpredictability, emotional inconsistency, tight indoor spaces, chaotic schedules, constant environmental change. The dog's nervous system never fully settles. Imagine feeling responsible for protecting a world that never stops moving. That's the hidden exhaustion many guardian breeds experience. They stay alert for so long that hypervigilance becomes their emotional baseline. Rest stops feeling like rest, observation becomes obsession, protection becomes psychological overextension, and families often misread the signs completely. They think the dog is becoming dominant, jealous, possessive. Sometimes the reality is simpler and sadder. The dog is overloaded, emotionally flooded by a lifestyle its instincts were never designed to process without careful structure and guidance. Because despite how beautifully Cane Corsos photograph inside modern homes, many are psychologically incompatible with chaotic family environments unless owners intentionally teach them how to emotionally disengage from responsibility. Otherwise, the house slowly stops feeling like a home. It starts feeling like a system everyone is trying not to disturb. But the real emotional damage often happens somewhere owners rarely think to look. Children don't just grow up around powerful dogs. They grow up adapting to them. And that adaptation often happens so quietly that parents barely notice it unfolding. At first, it looks harmless. A child learning boundaries, learning respect, learning how to behave around a large guardian breed. But over time, the emotional adjustments can become much deeper than simple obedience or safety awareness. Children begin reading the dog constantly. They notice which sounds trigger alertness, which movements cause the dog to suddenly stare, which games create tension in the room. They learn when to lower their energy, when to avoid roughhousing, when to move carefully through certain spaces of the house. Not because anyone formally teaches them, because emotional environments teach children automatically. Some kids become more cautious, more anxious, more emotionally restrained inside their own home without fully understanding why. Others go in the opposite direction and become overly confident around power, mistaking familiarity with a massive guardian breed for emotional control over it. Both responses can distort a child's relationship with tension, especially when the adults themselves are emotionally adapting to the dog in real time. Because Cane Corsos don't just absorb individual emotions, they absorb family dynamics, conflict between siblings, stress between parents, uneven emotional energy during chaotic evenings. The dog watches it all, responds to it all, and sometimes amplifies it without meaning to. One child screams, the dog becomes alert. Another child reacts nervously. The adults tense. The dog notices the tension increasing, and suddenly the emotional atmosphere loops back on itself, again and again. That's what makes emotionally intense guardian breeds so psychologically complex inside family homes. Even when the dog is deeply loving with children, and many Cane Corsos truly are, the emotional gravity they bring into a household can still reshape how family members behave around one another. Love does not erase intensity, and obedience alone does not solve emotional overload. A Cane Corso can know every command perfectly while still carrying unhealthy emotional responsibility inside the home. That's why emotional management matters more than mechanical control. The real goal is not simply teaching the dog to listen, it's teaching the dog that it does not need to emotionally supervise the family to keep them safe. And ironically, the more the family loves the dog, the harder it becomes to admit something feels wrong. Some families spend years trying to fix behaviors that are actually symptoms of emotional overload. That's the emotional trap. because by the time the household starts feeling exhausted, the bond with the dog is already incredibly deep. The Cane Corso is no longer a pet. It has become part of the family's emotional identity, their protector, their routine, their source of comfort, sometimes even the emotional center of the entire household. So when stress starts building, many owners don't feel frustration first. They feel guilt. Guilt for feeling overwhelmed, guilt for needing space, guilt for questioning whether the environment is truly healthy for the dog or for themselves. And social pressure makes it worse. Online, people repeat the same message constantly. If you train properly, everything works. If problems exist, the owner must be failing somehow, not exercising enough, not leading enough, not socializing enough. So families push harder. More structure, more correction, more management, while quietly ignoring the emotional fatigue spreading through the house. Because sometimes the issue isn't disobedience, it's emotional saturation. Many owners also confuse emotional dependence with loyalty, the constant shadowing, the inability to relax apart from the family, the obsessive monitoring. At first, these behaviors feel flattering, even beautiful. They make the relationship seem unusually deep. But emotional dependence can slowly trap both sides. The family becomes responsible for regulating the dog's emotional state at all times. The dog becomes unable to emotionally detach from the family's tension, and eventually everyone starts carrying everyone else's stress. That kind of emotional management is exhausting, not for a week, for years, which is why conversations about rehoming become emotionally devastating for some families. Because admitting the environment may not be working can feel like admitting failure, betrayal, or even loss, especially after building an entire identity around the idea of being a Cane Corso family. But beneath all of this tension, there's one heartbreaking truth most Cane Corso owners eventually discover. The Cane Corso's greatest strength may also be the source of its suffering. Because underneath all the intensity, all the vigilance, all the emotional pressure these dogs bring into a household, there is usually not malice, there is responsibility. For centuries, Cane Corsos were bred to work beside humans with clear structure, clear purpose, and clear expectations. They were never designed to emotionally interpret the chaos of modern domestic life on their own. Their instincts were meant to function within partnership, guidance, direction, stability. But many modern homes offer something very different: affection without clarity, love without emotional boundaries, and for a breed this psychologically sensitive to responsibility, that absence can become crushing. A Cane Corso without calm leadership often starts believing the emotional safety of the household depends on them, watching everyone, monitoring everything, carrying tension they were never meant to carry alone. That's why so many behaviors people label as dominance feel misunderstood once you look deeper. The staring, the blocking, the inability to relax, the obsessive attachment, the constant supervision. Sometimes the dog is not trying to control the family. Sometimes it is trying to hold the family together in the only way its instincts understand, and that changes the emotional meaning of the entire story. Because suddenly the Cane Corso stops looking like a cold, overpowering animal struggling for authority and starts looking like an emotionally overloaded guardian desperately trying to protect a world that never taught it when to finally rest. And once you understand that, the entire breed suddenly feels different. A Cane Corso can become an extraordinary family companion, deeply loyal, emotionally connected, protective in ways that feel almost primal. For some families, the bond becomes one of the most meaningful relationships they will ever experience with an animal. But that bond comes with emotional weight many people never anticipate until they are already living inside it. Because Cane Corsos do not simply exist within emotional environments, they magnify them. Calm becomes calmer, tension becomes heavier, chaos becomes impossible for the dog to ignore. And that's the emotional whiplash at the center of this breed. The realization that protection and pressure can sometimes look almost identical from the inside, that the same instincts making the dog feel heroic, loving, and devoted can also slowly fill a household with invisible emotional strain if those instincts are never guided properly. Owning a Cane Corso is rarely just about owning a pet. It feels more like emotionally coexisting with a living security system that loves you deeply enough to carry responsibilities you never asked it to carry. And maybe that's why this breed leaves such a lasting psychological imprint on the people who live with it. Because once you've shared a home with a true guardian, you start realizing protection is not always peaceful. If you've lived with a Cane Corso, you probably know this feeling already. At some point, you realize this wasn't just a big dog. Something about the emotional energy of the house had changed. Maybe it was the way guests behaved, the way your family adjusted routines, the way the dog watched everything, all the time. Or maybe it was the moment you understood your Cane Corso wasn't trying to dominate the home, it was trying to protect it emotionally. So tell me in the comments, did your Cane Corso quietly change the emotional atmosphere of your family life? And when was the moment you realized this breed was psychologically different from other dogs you've known? If this documentary resonated with you, there's another breed whose emotional intensity transforms households in a completely different way. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Because some dogs protect your home, others quietly reshape it.